I have one more official task to perform at a CBC dinner, and it is the pleasant one of introducing Stanley Fischer. Stan was our Felix Rohatyn Award recipient last year, and it was a pleasure to make contact with him and to get to know him over the past year. He was appointed to the Federal Reserve Board by President Obama and became its vice chair shortly thereafter. Before joining the Fed, he was governor of the Bank of Israel, vice chair of Citigroup, and also served stints with the IMF and the World Bank. He is the economist's economist. And now that he's back in New York working at BlackRock, I look forward to seeing more of him, and I hope he will become actively engaged with CBC's work. Tonight, he's moving from honoree to presenter of our most important award for high civic service to Federal Chair Jay Powell. Please welcome Stanley Fischer, and thank you all.
Well, good evening, and thanks very much for allowing me to talk about Jay Powell. We are a democracy, so these things are possible most of the time. It's a real honor and pleasure to introduce Jay. He's the chair of the Fed, we know that, and he's chair of the Federal Open Market Committee, which comes with being chair of the Fed. And I'm honored to be talking to this distinguished crowd for the second year in a row. It may be superfluous to introduce Jay Powell, you may say, since everyone here knows who he is, and some of the things he's been doing lately, and some of the things that have been done to him lately. Jay and I were both members of the previous Federal Reserve Board, the board of which Janet Yellen was the chair. But Jay was appointed to the Fed board when Ben Bernanke was chairman, so he has had the opportunity to work with two highly successful Fed chairs, and thus to learn from both Ben Bernanke and Janet. Jay has an easy personality, and he's an easy person to like. He treats his colleagues and his staff with respect and with decency. He's also a prodigious worker. Rumor among the basement crowd, that is the people who park in the basement of the Eccles building, in which the offices of board members are located, was that Jay was usually the first one in, often by 5 a.m., and he still does it. However, he's not only a workaholic, he's also a vigorous sportsman. My wife and I used to live in Georgetown, while Jay and his wife and their family lived further out. I used to run, these days I jog, out of Georgetown westward along the canal, while Jay and his bicycling buddies rode into town on those occasions that he'd not already parked in the basement. Any time that I saw a largish crowd of cyclists coming at high speed in my direction, it was a fair bet that Jay was among them and that it was time to get out of the way. He not only rides a bike, he loves swimming, golf, tennis, and no doubt other sports about which I've not yet heard. He's not only a sportsman, but also a musician. And rumor has it that at the lighting of the Christmas tree last year, for the first time, Jay and the new vice chairman of the Fed, Rich Clarida, entertained the attendees with a guitar duet. Not only that, but that the music was also musical. What about Jay as chair of the Fed and the FOMC? I've not seen him do either, but I'm sure that the person we see doing the post-meeting press conferences is exactly the same person as the one who chairs the board. That is to say, down to earth, balanced, calm, and with a quiet and wry sense of humor. Now, all that's about Jay the person. I want to conclude a little bit on policy. And I'll briefly discuss a key aspect of Jay's performance as chair of the Fed, his success at maintaining the Fed's independence. As the former central bank governors in this audience will testify, there is a fear among new governors of central banks that they will at some point be tested. By what? Well, the former British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, which the older among you will remember, was once asked by a journalist what kept him awake at night. His answer was, "Events, dear boy, events." Well, events might be anticipated, but in any case, they never turn out exactly as anticipated. It happened to Jay, except that he was the recipient of 3 events. The first was the beginning of signs of a slowdown in the growth rate of the economy. The second was a threat to the global trading system, an essential element in the creation of the global economy that in the last 40 years has reduced global poverty at a rate more rapid than ever before in history. And the third event is the ongoing political pressure on the Fed. Jay has answered these pressures in keeping with everything I know about him and the Fed. The staff of the Fed is first rate, and Jay has a staff that is technically able to deal with all 3 classes of events with which they have had to contend. But the staff needs to be led. Jay and his colleagues and the staff are unalterably committed to making monetary policy with a focus only on their mandate, their legal mandate, to promote maximum employment and price stability. Under Jay's leadership, the Fed has come through an extremely difficult period with its independence intact. And for that, we all owe him and his colleagues on the FOMC and the Fed staff our gratitude. And we are grateful to the Citizens Budget Commission for enabling us to thank Jay formally this evening for what the Fed has done so far under his leadership, and what we are confident will continue to do as events confront our economy and the world economy. For the Fed is not only the most important central bank in the United States, in the Americas, it is the most important central bank in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan. And thank you also to the Citizens Budget Commission for this great honor. I was struck by 3 things in your mission statement: independence, objective research, and service to all citizens. I can't say it any better than that. I mean, that very much resonates for someone from the Fed, and I can't think of a time in my life when those values have been more important for public service. So I'm honored to receive your award tonight. Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak here this evening at the 87th Annual Awards Dinner, and tonight I will start with the near-term outlook for the U.S. economy, surprisingly enough. Then I will turn to a topic that is inspired by your mission statement, which focuses on the well-being of future New Yorkers. I imagine that future New Yorkers attending this dinner in 50 years may not look back on the near-term outlook in February 2018 as very interesting or important. So tonight, after a brief review of the here and now, I will focus on an issue that is likely to be of more lasting importance: the need for policies that will support and encourage participation in the labor force, promote longer-term growth in our rapidly evolving economy, and spread the benefits of that prosperity as widely as possible. So to begin with the here and now. Congress has charged us at the Fed with achieving maximum employment and stable prices, our well-known dual mandate. And I'm pleased to say that, judged against these goals, the economy is in a good place. The current economic expansion has been underway for almost 10 years now, and this long period of growth has pushed the unemployment rate down near historic lows. These charts will be coming up periodically. By the way, these are available on the internet for those of you who are prone to that sort of thing. Feel free to download them. The employment gains have been broad-based across all racial and ethnic groups and all levels of educational attainment, as well as among the disabled. And while the unemployment rate for African Americans and Hispanics remains above the rates for whites and Asians, the disparities have narrowed appreciably as the economic expansion has continued. Nearly all job market indicators are better than a few years ago, and many are at their most favorable level in decades. After lagging earlier in the expansion, wages and overall compensation, meaning pay plus benefits, are now growing faster than a few years ago. It is especially encouraging that the labor force participation rate of people in their prime working years, that's ages 25 through 54, has been rising for the last 3 years. More plentiful jobs and rising wages are drawing more people into the workforce and encouraging others who might have left to stay. In addition, business sector productivity growth, which had been disappointing during this expansion, moved up in the first 3 quarters of 2018. Rising productivity allows wages to increase without adding to inflation pressures, and sustained productivity growth is a necessary ingredient for longer-run improvements in living standards. The price stability side of our mandate is also in a good place. After remaining below our target for several years, inflation by our preferred measure averaged roughly 2% last year. Inflation has softened a bit since then, largely reflecting the recent drop in oil prices. Futures markets, and other indicators suggest that oil prices are unlikely to fall further, and if that proves correct, oil's drag on overall inflation will subside. Consistent with that view, core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices and often provides a better signal of where inflation is heading, is currently running just a touch below our 2% objective. Signs of upward pressure on inflation appear muted despite the strong labor market. While the data that I've discussed so far give a favorable picture of the economy, it's also important to acknowledge that not everyone has shared in the benefits of the expansion to the same extent, and that too many households still struggle to make ends meet. In addition, over the past few months, we have seen some cross-currents and conflicting signals about the near-term outlook. For instance, growth has slowed in some major economies, particularly China and Europe. Uncertainty is elevated around some unresolved government issues, including particularly Brexit and the ongoing trade negotiations. And financial conditions have tightened since last fall. While most of the incoming domestic economic data have been solid, some surveys of businesses and consumer sentiment have moved lower. Unexpectedly weak retail sales for December also give reason for caution. Given the positive outlook, but also muted inflation pressures and the cross-currents I mentioned, the Federal Open Market Committee is going to be patient as we determine what future adjustments to the target rate for the federal funds rate may be appropriate to support our objectives. This common sense risk management approach has served the committee well, often in the past. So now I will turn from the near-term outlook to the question of how the economy will perform over the longer term. From 1991 through 2007, the economy expanded annually at about 3%. Similar to the pace for much of the second half of the 20th century. Since 2007, however, growth has averaged just 1.6%. If the earlier 3% growth had persisted over the past 12 years, incomes today would be almost 20% higher than they now are. From the standpoint of future Americans, if this slower rate of growth persists for a half century, incomes will end up roughly half of what they would have been at the higher growth rate. So why has growth slowed, and what can we do about it? To understand the causes of the slowdown, it's useful to divide growth into 2 components. First, growth in the cumulative number of hours worked by all workers, and second, by growth in the amount of output created per hour. We refer to the output per hour of work as labor productivity. So from 1991 through 2007, when the economy expanded at a 3% average rate, hours worked increased about 1% a year, and economy-wide productivity grew about 2% per year. You can see that on the far right of the chart. Since 2007, both of these factors have slowed by about half, with hours worked annually increasing only about 0.5% from 2008 to 2018, and productivity rising just 1% on average. So let's talk about hours worked. Growth in hours worked has slowed in part because of slower U.S. population growth. Birth rates have edged down and immigration has slowed. Not only is the total population growing more slowly, but the share of the population in their prime working years is falling steadily as the very large baby boom generation is moving into retirement. Demographic factors are generally slow-moving and predictable, and there's no surprise at all in the fact that slower population growth and the retirement of baby boomers are now contributing to slower growth in the total amount of work performed in the economy. But there is another factor contributing to the slower growth in hours, and this factor is more surprising and more troubling. It's important to note that to be counted as in the labor force, a person must either be employed or have looked for work within the last 4 weeks. The share of people working age in their prime years who are actually in the labor force has fallen significantly since the late 1990s. And this decline raises the important question of why people of working age have increasingly chosen not to work. The data suggest that there are both positive and more problematic forces at work. For example, among those aged 16 through 24, participation in the labor force has fallen from about 65% in the 1990s to 55% now. But this drop in participation appears to reflect young people getting more education. The fraction of this age group who are neither in school nor in the labor force has held fairly constant through this period, and measures of school enrollment are up. Higher educational attainment is much more important in today's job market than in the past, and investing in education today has long-term benefits for both the student and for society. Statistics confirm that higher educational attainment is associated with higher labor force participation, lower unemployment, and higher wages. Turning to those aged 25 to 54, the participation picture is more troubling. Among these prime-aged men, participation has been falling for more than 60 years, with the decline averaging about 1.5% per decade. For women, participation rose over the second half of the 20th century until peaking in the late 1990s. Since then, women's participation has dropped a bit as well. To put these numbers in a little bit of context, let's look at the data from the 34 advanced economies, including the United States. Prime-age male, and this is on the left, the red bars are for 2017 and the blue dots are for 1995. It may be hard to see, but I'll tell you what it says. Prime-age male participation has fallen across most of these economies since 1995. But the decline in the United States has been much larger than most, and U.S. participation was below the middle of the pack at the outset. As a result, the United States now has the fourth lowest participation rate for prime-age males of the 34 advanced economies. For women's participation, the details are different, but the bottom line is similar on the right. In the mid-1990s, the United States ranked in the upper tier for prime-age women's participation, but since then, participation by women has advanced rapidly in many countries while it has declined slightly in the United States. Now the United States is sixth lowest among women among these 34 countries. So researchers have investigated numerous possible reasons for the decline in prime-age participation. Among men, the drop in participation is much sharper for those with only a high school education or less. The drop for women is also sharper for those who are high school educated. And this pattern is consistent with the idea that a modern economy demands ever higher skills and that workers without those skills are being left behind. The international experience also suggests that this outcome is not inevitable. The drop in participation among those with less education is much smaller in some comparable countries than the United States. The research into labor force participation in the U.S. and across the world does not find a single magic fix, a magic bullet, but it does suggest a variety of policies that might better prepare people for the modern workforce, as well as support and reward labor force participation. Now, I should note here that the Fed has neither the tools nor the mandate to directly address the forces that are holding back participation. We can contribute by fostering a strong labor market in accordance with our mandate. And while it is not our role to advocate particular labor force policies, I do want to put a spotlight on this important issue. Policies that bring prime-age workers into productive employment, particularly those who may have been left behind because of low skills or educational attainment, would bring great benefits both to those workers and to our economy. The second factor accounting for the slowdown in GDP growth is the slower pace of labor productivity growth, or output per hour worked. When measured annually, labor productivity growth is volatile, as you can see from the blue lines, But focusing on the 5-year averages, that's the fat red line, we can see that from 1975 through 2007, productivity growth averaged about 2%, while fluctuating in a range of 1% to 4%. Since then, growth seems to have settled at the low end of that historical figure. Unlike the situation with labor force participation, the slowdown in productivity growth is also evident in most advanced economies, and the U.S. experience is roughly comparable to that of other countries. There's an ongoing debate about the implications of this global slowdown in productivity growth. Some argue that the rapid growth seen over much of the 20th century was historically anomalous, and that we're destined to return to the slower growth of centuries past. Others are more optimistic that strong productivity growth can continue. Many have noted that during the current expansion, investment and capital accumulation have been lower than previous expansions, so perhaps we just need to invest more. Unfortunately, it does not seem to be that simple. Standard reasoning holds that capital per worker drives productivity. So while we've seen slower capital accumulation of late, we've also seen slower growth in the labor supply. Thus, capital per worker has continued to increase roughly at its pre-recession trend. And in this view, the productivity problem is not simply one of inadequate investment. So researchers have proposed several reasons why, even if the quantity of investment is kept up, recent investment may be leading to smaller productivity advances than in the past. The more optimistic analysts argue that we may be in a productivity lull, while businesses work to realize the full benefit of advances that are embedded in recent investment. Others suggest that productivity-advancing ideas are inherently harder to find and exploit than in the past, implying that slower productivity growth may be with us for the long haul. This debate is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. In the meantime, we should look for policies that will create an environment in which productivity can flourish. We need policies that support innovation and create a favorable environment for investment in both the skills of workers and the tools they have. Indeed, the recent tax reforms were designed in part to boost capital investment and thus productivity. Once again, my goal tonight is to highlight the importance of growth-enhancing policies. Because these policies are not the province of the Fed, I won't advocate for any particular approaches. Instead, I'll just observe that researchers and policy analysts have proposed many promising ideas that should be capable of attracting wide support. Policies that succeed in enhancing productivity growth would greatly benefit future generations of Americans. To conclude, the United States is currently in the midst of one of the longest economic expansions in our history. Unemployment is low, inflation is close to our 2% objective. My colleagues and I on the FOMC are focused on using our monetary policy tools to sustain those favorable conditions. Tonight, I've also highlighted some longer-term challenges that we face, including low labor force participation by prime-age workers and low productivity growth. By promoting macroeconomic stability, the Fed helps create a healthy environment for growth. But these longer-term issues require policies that are more in the province of our elected representatives. The nation would benefit greatly from a search for policies with broad appeal that could promote labor force participation and higher productivity with benefits shared broadly across the nation. Thanks, and thank you very much for the award tonight.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Could we have a picture? That would be wonderful. I appreciate it.
I'll tell you, it's been a hell of a week. Yeah, you know, I testified. I had
Thank you all very